I'm Pat Kiernan, and welcome to Pat's Papers. We go through newspapers from across the country to pick out the most important headlines. Here's what we found today. Across the country this morning, the Bernie Madoff story gets remarkably prominent placement. It is on the front page of the Denver Post with the word that the money manager will plead guilty tomorrow in New York to what we had been calling a $50 billion scam, now recalculated to $65 billion. The Vindicator in Ohio puts the story up front, predicting a guilty plea on 11 counts. Of course, in the city where it happened, this is front page news. The New York Daily News headline is "Bye Bye Bernie." The headline on the main story on pages 2 and 3 is "Penthouse to Big House," and the lead sentence is quite blunt about his future. It says Madoff will likely die in prison. To the Wall Street Journal, also leading with Madoff, the story says investors are expected to mob a federal courthouse in New York tomorrow to air their grievances. Front page coverage in the New York Times noting there are still unanswered questions about the involvement of Madoff's family members and employees. On to education. President Barack Obama said yesterday that American children may have to spend more time at school each day if they are to compete for jobs against foreign educated students. The Miami Herald quotes the president saying, "We can no longer afford an academic calendar designed when America was a nation of farmers who needed their children at home plowing the land at the end of the day." One of my favorite quotes today, that Quebec is the OPEC of maple syrup. The maple sugar season's underway. The New York Times tells us already the predictions are that syrup will be very expensive this year. Just how expensive will be determined by pricing in Quebec, which dominates the maple syrup world with about 70% of the production. A disturbing story from China. In the Washington Post, it's becoming increasingly apparent that the Chinese government did not fulfill all of the promises of openness during the Olympics last year. Despite the pretense that protests would be allowed, no permits were actually issued to anyone to use the protest zones. Who ever thought that I would read this headline? There is great controversy in the quilting world today. The Chicago Tribune reports on the images of a gun-toting Jesus and nakedness that are causing a kerfuffle over the newest issue of Quilter's Home magazine. The big craft store Joann's has pulled the magazine from its shelves. Two stories about Abraham Lincoln today. The Los Angeles Times, among the papers looking at his old watch. Legend had said an immigrant watchmaker named Jonathan Dillon had tried to send a secret message to the president by scratching it inside the watch case. The Smithsonian now confirms that story, sort of, but says the inscription was not exactly as Dillon had remembered it. Another Lincoln story this morning in the Chicago Tribune with Ulysses S. Grant's great-great-grandson discovering a photograph taken in front of the White House. It appears to show Lincoln, though it will be tough to confirm it's him. It would be the only known photo of the 16th president in front of the executive mansion. It could be the last image taken of him before he was assassinated in 1865. Big news in Texas this morning is over mistreatment of disabled students at a state school in Corpus Christi. Police describe a fight club organized by employees who had been entrusted with the care of the disabled residents. In the Dallas Morning News, Police Captain Tim Wilson said, "I've heard of isolated incidents before, but what's most appalling is that it's obvious this is organized." The Corpus Christi Caller-Times describes 20 videos captured on a cell phone that will be used as evidence. Residents are seen shoving and hitting each other while employees watch. The headline in Houston is "Mentally Disabled Forced into Fight Club." The front page of the Birmingham News, coverage of the killing spree spanning 3 southern Alabama towns, leaving at least 10 dead. Among the dead are the gunman's mother, grandfather, grandmother, aunt, and uncle. The coroner said he cleaned his family out. It ended when the man shot himself. As the economy shrinks, American farms are shrinking. The headline is E-I-E-I-O, which could lead you to believe it's a happy old MacDonald had a farm story. It is not. The Chattanooga Times Free Press analyzes the numbers that show 1.5 million acres of farmland lost or given up in Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama over the past 10 years. One Tennessee farmer says, if you toil along for a few years without making any money, eventually you are going to have to give it up. Some banks are saying the bailout program is too much trouble. The New York Times says banks large and small, at least the ones who can afford it, are trying to give back the federal bailout money because there are too many strings attached. Michelle Malkin's column this morning in the New York Post is interesting. I'm reminded of something I do when I book a trip, but I'm talking about booking a rental car or a hotel room, not an entire government plane. This is about Nancy Pelosi's use of government planes for her travel as House Speaker. Malkin describes the exasperated Defense Department officials who say Pelosi seems to book some flights just in case she wants to travel and then will cancel at the last minute. A follow-up story on something we covered a few days ago, also in the New York Post. Jim Cramer is going to do Jon Stewart's show tomorrow night. Stewart ripped CNBC last week on The Daily Show for a long string of inaccurate predictions about the stock market. Now Cramer will go on to answer some of that criticism. Well, this really isn't the way we wanted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. From the Boston Globe, new figures showing the recession helped to drive down global warming emissions. Northeast power plants kicked up their lowest emissions in 9 years. One spokesman for industry says this is no cause for celebration. He says we could get 100% below the cap if we shut down every business and move them out of state. Finally, from San Francisco, the marijuana controversy surrounding Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps was good for somebody. Kellogg's responded to that controversy, saying it would not renew the endorsement contract for Phelps. But what about all that cereal that was out there with Phelps' face on it? Columnist C.W. Nevius in the San Francisco Chronicle says today the answer to that seemed pretty clear 2 weeks ago when the local food bank took delivery of nearly 2 tons of Phelps cereal. And that does it for today's report on Pat's Papers. You can go to our website, patspapers.com, to find this report and to find links to the stories we've mentioned today.